Hello, Story Seekers. I'm Ben.
I'm Nico, and you're listening to The Tiny Bookcase.
Our guest for this episode writes YA and adult fiction. They describe themselves as genrequeer, as they refuse to stay in any one category.
Their debut novel, The Butterfly Assassin, is a YA thriller about a traumatised teenage assassin trying, and failing, to live an ordinary life, and it's coming out later this month. We'd like to welcome Finn Longman.
Hello, Finn.
Hello.
How goes it? It must be quite an exciting time with the debut novel coming out at the end of the month.
Yeah, it's pretty busy. I've moved house 3 times in the last 6 months, which isn't helping. But
any particular reason? Do you just like it?
I hate moving, but unfortunately,
Caravan.
I can't drive, so that would be quite limited. But yeah, life is just a transitional stage, let's say. So
fair enough. I have seen. I know you've got a YouTube channel as well that you upload stuff to.
Yes.
And I saw your unboxing video of the cover, which is very cool, and they're really nice covers.
Yes, that was a process.
Yeah? Did you have much say in it?
A reasonable amount of opportunities to give feedback, but like not a lot of control over the kind of underlying concept or approaches. So there was a few points where it was a bit tense because I'm very picky.
But I'm extremely diplomatic.
I mean, I'm really happy with the final one. There was a few things that like earlier in the process had been a bit like, oh, do we have to do this? But it worked out in the end, so that's good.
Wicked. The only other thing that we didn't mention in our intro is that my understanding is that you're like would you refer to yourself as a medievalist?
Yeah, I'm a medievalist specialising in medieval Irish literature, specifically the Ulster cycle.
That is really cool. I did one module on medieval literature at uni, and I loved it. It was really really fun time. So did you do your undergrad in that or your postgrad or?
So my undergrad is in Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic, but I was the Celtic part of that because Irish was the only thing I took all 3 years, although I did dabble in Old Norse and medieval French and stuff. But then I did a postgrad in early and medieval Irish, which I just finished in November. So that was one of my moves, was moving back from Ireland after doing that.
I can barely speak English.
Oh, don't worry, my Irish is crap. Well, I'm about 800 years behind the time with my pronunciation.
I was going to say, is it like ancient Gaelic or something?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm very much a literature person rather than a language person, but obviously you have to engage with the language to engage with the literature. But when I speak modern Irish, then I just have this really, really cursed hybrid dialect that's like 50% medieval, and then the rest is just this weird mishmash of local dialects.
You've got a time traveler's accent, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, it's quite cursed, which is why I generally don't speak Irish in public.
Here's the trip. Go to Ireland and pretend to be a vampire.
I mean, there isn't a huge amount of sun, so you should be okay, right?
I mean, I am photosensitive, nocturnal, and unable to eat garlic, so to be honest, I'm not sure I'd be pretending.
That's really close. You've just got to get over the whole blood thing, and then you...
Yeah.
Just refuse to go anywhere unless you are specifically invited in. Just start laying the groundwork now.
Oh, well, that's just called having anxiety.
Oh, fuck, now I'm a vampire.
Right, I think time for some stories. So, regular listeners know it by now, but we'll be telling 3 new stories, and all of them have been written to the same shared prompt. This week, the prompt, which has been chosen by Finn, is Crash Test Dummies. And Nico, you're up first.
Crash Test Dummies. Simon was forced, in these penultimate moments before his inevitable scientific triumph, to admit that things had, in a certain manner, got somewhat out of hand. He couldn't be certain if it was the words of his, now sadly ex-wife, ringing in his ears, words like psychotic, dangerous, and inadequately hung, wobbled around his head like cartoon birds around a dazed rabbit, or if it was that creeping sense of inadequacy that seems to trouble so many of the everyman. He reminded himself, in that instant, that he was not, in fact, the everyman, and was quite self-assuredly an absolute bloody genius. 6 months prior, like most scientists, Simon had found himself trying to work out exactly what was going to give him the best opportunity of receiving enough of a grant from the funding committee that he could, first and foremost, leave a mark on the scientific world, and secondly, start claiming his lunches on expenses. Egg and cress sandwiches don't pay for themselves, after all. In a fit of turbulent purpose, Simon had been forced to do the one thing all creators dread: research. So, with a satisfyingly chunky marker in hand, red of course, and a stack of submissions from the years past, Simon began looking for patterns. What got funded? Who got funded? It did not take long for things to become abundantly clear. Babies. That is not to say that babies were proposing inventions and being paid to create them, although if one were to be able to put together even a half-decent proposal, the possibility of being the scientist that backed the super baby would soon have had them throwing wads of cold hard cash at the infant's feet. It is, in fact, to say that anyone inventing anything for babies was likely to get backing. Less so now in the baby entertainment industry, which seemed to be entirely covered by Mozart right up until they left the womb, then an extremely sticky iPad for the next, say, 18 years. The baby safety industry, however, now that was absolutely booming. Simon had done some research and been amazed to find dozens of hard plastic gizmos, each one about the size of a decent wedding cake, all of which would protect your soft pink creature from the terrors of the world. Most of which, it had to be said, seemed to involve other people in cars making a nuisance of themselves. So, with this in mind, Simon went looking for a gap in the market, and by Jove did he believe he'd found one. Armed only with some simple sketches and the appropriate buzzwords, Simon had stood before the committee and, much to his relief, received light applause, 2 warm smiles, and a cheque for nearly £500,000. This had, however, left him in a somewhat awkward position of actually having to invent the bloody thing. So, the first payrolled sarnie in hand, Simon set about earning those delicious chunks of egg and stalks of cress. And now, months later, sweat already beading on his nervous forehead, here he was, £500,000 lighter and about 6 stone heavier, on account of the near-constant trail of sandwiches he was consuming. The last £50 had in fact gone to a babysitter he'd met at the back of the arena they were using to display this year's raft of inventions. He didn't ask if the infant's parents knew that the babysitter had borrowed the tiny human, mostly because he was smart enough to know about plausible deniability. The young lady had said something about being back in an hour before wandering off counting the last drops of wealth that had led Simon to what he was still sure would be his crowning achievement. He had felt confident as he crossed the arena floor to a smattering of applause from the gathered crowd. It has to be said, these people were, like NASCAR fans, mostly there for the disasters. They had little to no interest in actual science, but there had been a couple of highlights today already. Specifically, the body of the man who'd built the arousal-powered heli hat having yet to descend from the heavens, and the buxom woman who he'd been in a video call with had long faded into silence. He had felt, if not confident, then at least cool, as he placed the infant into the seat-like apparatus that sat at one end of the contraption. Not his contraption, heavens no. This was a classic design, referred to by scientists as a self-managing velocity augmentation device, and by the layman as, bugger me, is that a trebuchet? He had, it must be admitted, begun to worry just a little at the edge as he gently placed his device between the child's lips and watched it begin the process of suckling. This was, after all, the first time he'd performed any tests on an actual baby. It couldn't be that much different to a watermelon with a face drawn on. Maybe louder. As he stood before the assembled doom-seekers and held aloft a replica of his creation, his budget having stretched to only one working machine, the calm and cool was replaced by a sort of sociopathic giddiness. This is what we play for, he thought, before mentally chiding himself for sounding like a wanker. With a squeal, the mic before him sprang to life, and he spoke into it. Assembled scientists, members of the committee, and seekers of wonderment. His warning about sounding like a wanker had clearly failed to set in. My name is Professor Simon Erdman, and I present you today my innovation in infant safety. He gestured broadly at the baby sucking a pacifier strapped into a trebuchet. The doom-seeking crowd members leant forward excitedly. Encased in the infant's dummy, he said, holding the replica aloft, is a high-powered airbag. If the infant were to reach a certain velocity, this will deploy, guaranteeing the infant a safe landing. Now that he said it in front of people, and the committee, of course, do not count as people, as anyone on a panel denying funding to everyone is clearly barely a person, it did sound a bit mental. The collective crowd stared at him in wide-mouthed expectancy. He froze for just a moment, and then a series of noises filled his world. Clunk! Swoosh! He span in time to see the arm of the trebuchet swing up, and the baby release at its zenith. The wall of the arena loomed thick and impenetrable before the child, who had fast achieved terminal velocity. Ah! Woomph! The bag had deployed with explosive force. Whee! Clang! The baby, wailing with joy, had collided with one of the large inventions to the side. It clanged loudly, tipped perilously, and began what can only be described as a comically large and explosive series of domino collapses. The crowd were on their feet now. This idiot had more than delivered. The baby spun in the air. With a giggle, it began its descent to the hard arena floor. Crunk! Ba-boom! Simon turned to his left. The final domino in the great chain of inventions had begun its inexorable, flaming collapse toward him. The seemingly endless metal structure, adorned with a helpful yellow sticker that warned that it was big and explosive, descended towards him with frightening speed. He thought for a moment of running, but £450,000 worth of sandwiches fought back, and his body, in an effort to have at least tried, began sweating profusely. He turned back to see a soft, bouncing impact, a deflation, and a still giggling child rolling in the now limp airbag. To give himself credit, he thought, the child was completely unharmed, and his next formed, descended rapidly and came to rest between his feet.
Bonkers story. Absolutely off the wall. It was like an episode of a cartoon show, wasn't it?
A lot of slapstick.
So much.
Oh yeah.
I wouldn't have had the nuts and bolts to try and put slapstick like that into a story, but I think it worked. Like the mental image was really clear, and all the sound effects really brought it to life.
It was definitely a risk. Even as I was writing, I thought, God, like, what would be 5 minutes of action in a cartoon is about 4 seconds on the page. It's not a lot written down.
No, the inadequacy stuff at the start for this character, was really quite unpleasant in like a lacking of pathos kind of way. Like I didn't feel like this guy just felt like a real loser from the start, and it does keep that going the whole way through. So it's almost like it's like Did you ever see Some Mothers Do Have 'Em? It's like that kind of, I forget what he's called. The main
about
character.
that for a long time.
Yeah, he's got that kind of vibe to him. It's just like one of life's losers.
Yeah. That's so harsh.
I know.
At least he did his research, though. There's being a loser and not doing anything about it, and then there's being a loser and being like, right, how do I logic my way out of this?
Also, opinion on egg crust sandwiches, because I think they're disgusting.
Do you?
Yeah.
Savage.
I've never eaten one. But I'm
that-
allergic to like everything, so
I was going to say, is that because they look gross? Because they do look
it's
gross.
honestly never occurred to me. Like throughout my entire childhood, I ate one type of sandwich and I wouldn't try anything else. So
What was that one type of sandwich?
it had fruit spread in it, which was made by this company called Sunwheel, and you really can't buy it anymore. So it's kind of just as well I grew out of that phase. But I just ate fruit spread sandwiches every day for like 15 years.
Fruit spread is a terrifying phrase because it implies a difference to jam, but that difference
Yeah,
is
it's
not
like
implied.
it's like not sweet or not as sweet as jam. It's like more pure fruit. It's somewhere between jam and Marmite.
Marmite.
Oh,
That makes it sound really bad. It's not, but yeah, that's all I ate for like 15 years. So I'm not adventurous in my sandwich choices.
at the moment, it sounds worse to me than egg and cress sandwiches do. So I guess
I think it was apple and pear flavour.
I feel like that might have been a printed lie on the.
Oh, it definitely had fruit juice in it because when I developed an allergy to fruit, I also developed an allergy to fruit spread. So
Oh,
it was
no.
definitely fruit.
That's brutal.
Yeah.
Oh no.
I'm literally this. You know, I said I couldn't eat garlic. There's like the list of things I can't eat is long.
But blood is not on that list, right?
Not as far as I'm aware. Maybe that's
Yeah.
why I'm anemic because I
Me
just
too.
like haven't been drinking enough blood.
Yeah.
See me
It's
after
always.
class. Don't worry, I'll teach you some vampire stuff.
Have you got blood like that's available?
Mate, I'm full of it. Absolutely filled to the brim. I'm basically a jar of fruit spread.
The trebuchet, like so the actual concept of the trebuchet, I thought that was quite a good gag. Like having a different name for it, and then everybody else just being like, "That's a fucking trebuchet."
Oh yeah, that made me laugh. I had my mic muted so you didn't hear me snort. But
I love the idea of a scientist being like, yes, this is a piece of scientific equipment, and other people being like, did that guy just put a baby in a catapult? Because what? But yes, thank you for indulging my silliness with this one.
I enjoyed it. I think we will, especially when we eventually do get around to my one, we will harken back to these halcyon days of laughter and lightheartedness.
oh, mood. I feel like mine went way too dark.
Oh, sweet! All right, we're gonna go. Let's go. Right, let's. After you then, Finn.
Yeah, put your darkness where your mouth is.
Okay. The first death sentence I walked away from made me holy. Nobody survived crash tests. Not the pilots, not the ships. They were executions dressed up as a way for the techs to figure out how much salvage would be left the next time they went smashing their pretty little spaceships in another pointless war. Nothing more. But I survived. I got up out of the wreckage and I walked away, a little colder, a little older, with the taste of blood in my mouth. People said I was blessed, that it was the will of the gods who had seen my innocence and intervened. I wasn't innocent. But the gods, it seemed, didn't want to drag me down to the silent planet just yet. So there I was, walking around, pretending I couldn't see people praying whenever they caught sight of me. Sainthood. And I hadn't even had to die. Much. The second death sentence made me a fraud. It was a favour to a friend. He didn't deserve the conviction, and I'd survived once, so there was every chance I could do it again. Taking his place was simple. As long as somebody got in that cockpit, they never cared who it was. I figured this time it might actually stick, and I'd finally get what I deserved. What I'd been promised. It didn't stick. I walked away again, squinting into the sun, pale except for the blood, and veneration gave way to suspicion. It was rigged, people said. The crash tests were fake. The techs had let me live. They hadn't, but being a fraud was less pressure than being a saint, so I was okay with letting them believe whatever they liked, as long as it meant I didn't have to have answers. The third and fourth death sentences made me cursed. It was curiosity. I needed to know whether my luck was going to hold. And they were friends too, or at least acquaintances, and neither of them deserved to die, not the way I'd deserved it anyway. So I took their place, one after the other, and each time I came out the other side. Suspicion gave way to fear, to never even meeting my eyes, in case whatever I had was catching. I didn't think being God's forsaken was transmissible, but I wouldn't have put money on it, so I stayed out of their way too. Spent my days down by the salvage yards, minding my own business, hauling scrap, stepping in whenever there was a crash test verdict for someone I didn't want to see dead. Now here I was, 7 death sentences behind me. 7 flights, 7 falls, 7 moments of blackness when I thought, now I'm yours, and the shadow god said, not yet, Kiva Niwaraku, not yet, and kicked me back out of the silent planet and into the world of the living. A little less colour in my hair, in my eyes, a little less warmth in my blood. Otherwise the same, as far as anyone could tell. Anyone except me. I had high hopes for death sentence number 8, though. For starters, it was a stranger, and I was doing this because she was paying me, or my mother, if I didn't come back from this one, and I, or my mother, could really use the cash. So at that point, it wasn't noble self-sacrifice, it was a purely commercial transaction. The others were friends, I was personally invested. Maybe the gods had a soft spot for that. And secondly, Anya was a murderer and deserved this almost as much as I did the first time around. I'd read the trial reports. It was an airtight case. Admittedly, the man she killed got what was coming to him, if you were the sort to think a murder could be justified. But the law decreed a life for a life. And Anya definitely took his, which meant a crash test verdict. Her brother cried at the trial. She was dry-eyed, though, when I met with her in her cell and agreed to take her sentence. There was something about her, like she was looking for answers. Wanted to know why it was I kept surviving. I wanted to know that too. I wanted to know how many times they'd send me back before they finally let me rest. How much more of me they'd take while pushing me away. I'd stopped looking in mirrors when my eyes, once vivid blue, lost their colour, but I couldn't ignore the white strands in my hair. I shaved it off so I wouldn't have to look at them. It didn't help. I still felt cold, empty, a yawning void inside me. I still tasted blood in my mouth. So, a stranger and a guilty one. No redeeming power of love, and no claims to intervention for the innocent. If any of them could kill me, it would be this one. I wasn't supposed to hope for that. I was supposed to pray that I would walk away again. The ship was the same as the rest of them. A little smaller, maybe. They'd stripped out even more of the padding and the safety precautions, trying to make space for a bigger gun. Deactivated for this flight, of course, because giving a condemned criminal a ship with a light cannon was asking for trouble. But other than that, it was just like all the other ships I'd crashed. The stories said I was a pilot, maybe the best pilot in the solar system, to be able to keep surviving trips like this. But they were wrong. These death landings were the only times I ever sat in a cockpit, strapped in like a safety dummy with controls I wasn't convinced were connected to anything. It would have been nice to fly properly, one day, but I couldn't see anyone ever giving me the chance. Launch in 5, 4, 3. I closed my eyes. What about now? I asked the shadow gods in the darkness of my own mind. Isn't it time? But there was only silence, gradually obliterated by the growing roar of my engine. Maybe it was hopeless. Maybe I really was gods forsaken, and the shadow gods were as shameless as they were deathless, toying with me, teasing me with something I would never be allowed to have. All this flirting and no follow-through, I thought, as the ship locked onto its collision course, and in the moment of the crash, I thought I heard them laughing. I thought I heard them say, "Not like this, Kiva Niwaraku, not yet. Keep the warmth of your heart's blood a little longer." I thought somebody added, "They only love you while you've still a fate for them to weave with, little one." But maybe that was a hallucination, in the instant of brain death when the ship hit the ground and splintered into bloody fragments around me, tearing me apart. It was unlike the gods to be honest with me. The ship crashed, and I did exactly what pilots were supposed to do in crash tests like this. I died. It was quick enough. There are worse ways to go. But oblivion was brief, teasing, stripped away too fast, and then I stood up from the wreckage, smeared in ash and blood. I looked back at the horizon to the pollution glow of home, rust and iron on my tongue and my teeth, my skin cold, the sun a little too bright for my delicate eyes. Back again. Because despite their promises, despite everything I'd bargained for, the silent planet and its gods wouldn't take me. They loved my mortality, and still they kept robbing me of it, peeling away a piece of humanity every time they spat me back out. Not yet, Kiva Niwaraku. 8 times I'd knocked on their door. 8 times they'd turned me away, refused to let me stay dead. Anya wanted to know how it was I kept surviving. The others I'd fobbed off with excuses, wary of a blasphemy charge, but that look in her eye demanded answers, and maybe I'd give them to her. I'd died for her, after all. She deserved to know that. She deserved to know that she'd killed me, would have watched me buried, if it weren't for the fact that the shadow gods told as many lies as humans did. And here we were again, because they'd rather toy with a mortal than give me the freedom they'd promised me. 8 fatal crashes, and I was done with bargaining, pleading with the gods to acknowledge me. If I was cursed, then I'd make them regret cursing me. If I was blessed, then I'd profane every altar I touched. I would make them beg to give me back my deaths, make them wish they'd never saved me. I smiled a smile full of teeth. So the silent planet didn't want me. Fine. It was time to make some noise.
What a fucking great story.
That was wicked.
I was immediately hooked into that with the these big impactful lines that you opened with about your first death made you blessed, this kind of thing. And then there's so much going on. It's so rich.
Yeah, it got away from me slightly. I was like, oh yeah, what if I had just have this spaceship pilot who's really good at surviving crashes? And then my brain went, what if Death God's in space?
Death God's in space. I was so into that. The first time you mentioned the Silent Planet, I was just in. Was that a C.S. Lewis reference?
Yes, sort of. I mean, it was a sort of semi-unconscious one. I put it in there, and then I was like, wait, that one's taken.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. The idea of them being like drained of colour every time they come back, that's such a good physical indicator, and also really, it's like a cool concept that I can imagine people really glomming onto that and being. I can see people like cosplaying as this person. Do you know what I mean? Like it's such a strong character visualization.
You saying that, I got not the movie version, but I got really like big Thanos vibes from the character.
Oh,
this like dreadful criminal, just a monster who is trying to get to death and just can't die. And every time they get close to dying or actually die, they're just coming back for some reason. And I got that same kind of vibe, and then it got me down a path of, what did they do? What did this person do? And I got caught in a bit of a loop for a minute.
I'm not telling you. Mostly because I don't know.
It felt like there was enough depth to the background of the story, the setting, that you could have this be a part of a larger piece of work, like a novel or a novella or something. But
it very much felt like a story that could get away from me if I didn't keep a very firm hold on it.
Yeah, sure. But I think you did keep a firm hold on it because it did. Yeah. It's still tight. It's still this person's story. It's like a section of their story, and they have an arc which comes to an end when they make the decision that they're going to change the way that they're living their life at the end.
And your word economy is phenomenal because there's so much in there. So many things happen, but it never feels like you're skipping through things. It's all very well put together, all lined up exactly as it ought to be, to still fit in that word count and have absolute layers and layers and layers of story. Especially the really clever use of what you don't say. You're filling things in, and you're giving exactly the right sort of opinions in the rock for us to climb the sheer face of this story. I really enjoyed it.
That's a good way of putting it.
Thanks.
That was really good. Thank you so much for reading it to us. That was had a good time with that.
Really glad I went first with the throwing a baby out of a catapult. I wouldn't want to do that now.
I love that we can take the same prompt and get like a completely different vibe. So you can have trebuchets or you can have death gods. Like, choose your own adventure.
Why not both?
Mutually exclusive. Yeah.
Yeah. Next time I'll put Kiva in a trebuchet.
So go on. The name Kiva
Nuweraku.
Nuweraku. And
yes.
what's is that from something or a reference to something?
No. but that's just the name she walked into my head with. But it was a bit like, because there's different ways of pronouncing it depending on what dialect of Irish you speak. So Kiva is sometimes Quiva and Niweraku is sometimes Niveraku, depending. And it was a bit like, well, I'm just going to pronounce this the Ulster Irish way because there could be a Donegal in space. So we
Why
had a
not?
joke
Yeah.
that the alternate name for this story was a small moon orbiting County Donegal.
Nice. And then with the 8 deaths thing, I know
Yes.
that numbers can be kind of, they have their place in medieval mythic writing, don't they? Like 3 and 7. Is 8 a mythic number, or were you playing with 7 by making even 8 didn't work?
8 is, it's not particularly well in Irish lit, for example, 3s and 7s and 9s are very important. So 8 is kind of quite unmagical. It's my third favorite number, so
Oh, fair enough.
I partly picked it because of that. Which then always prompts the question of what's your first favorite, which is 4096, and then I have to explain that. So it's just
You sure do.
Yeah, now you do.
well, it's 64 squared, and 64 is 8 squared, which is why 8 is my third favorite.
Is 64 your second?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I
And
just
that's your
it's
second favourite because of the Nintendo 64. I understand.
well, I mean, I have to say, so my primary school maths teacher was obsessed with square numbers, so I used to know a lot of them, like all the way up for ages. And the way he made us remember 8 squared is I ate my Nintendo 64. But then because we were all so young, he had to explain that because most of us had never seen a Nintendo 64.
Well, I'm old.
But to be fair, the only games console I ever had in the house was a Sega Mega Drive, so I don't feel like my age either.
I'm currently getting my ass kicked every day by Nico and all my other friends at a like Wordle and Hurdle and all these like daily games. There's one called High Score Game Day, I think it's called, and it stills from typically quite retro games. And I have no working knowledge of most video games.
Yeah, I would be useless at that.
And these guys just like, oh yeah, that's that one, and it's from that console as well. I can tell. It's like, fuck me.
Me and my brother had the Mega Drive, and we used to play Columns, which was a Tetris ripoff, and Micro Machines, which was a racing game with really tiny cars.
Oh yeah, and top down. Really
yeah,
classic.
Loved Micro Machines.
Right, I'm not allowing you to escape this any longer, Ben. You must read us a story.
He always lets me try and spin it out for as long as possible.
Yeah, I just like the anticipation to get to the point where it actually hurts.
Okay, all right, here we go. Crash Test Dummies. The cars were naked. They would never be painted or have bonnet ornaments and badges. The bare metal of their frames and panels felt somehow organic then, like we were seeing them in a candid moment of nudity. The men watching treated us, predictably, as expendable objects, each of us with our own serial number. The cars, however, were their dreams, and the sweat of their brow wrought in iron. They loved those cars, and would raucously clap with delight during the testing, roaring their approval at the shattering collisions. That was many years ago, and today I bought myself a new red car. The American I bought it from said it was European-made, catching himself before he could say German. Like the geography was somehow responsible for the sadism. The gloss of the paint caught the Californian sun through the glass of the showroom walls, and I found myself fascinated by the way the curving bodywork concealed the chassis. The American was delighted at the sale, even going so far as to assure me that, had he been old enough to fight, he would gladly have laid down his life to end my imprisonment. I do not doubt that in a few generations, his children's children, and those like them across the world, will have forgotten the realities that went along with the iconography. They will have lost the meaning of the warnings. I bear on my arm an indelible reminder, but when my flesh rots away, that too will be lost, and society will have found a way to cover the hard frame of its origins with the curves of rationalization. The impacts broke our bodies. I watched hundreds of us get strapped into the naked cars and sent into oblivion collisions. Myself and the others were chained to the wall in the testing hall, and I found it impossible to look away. The engineers would increase speed or decrease harness restraints, as their tests progressed until the point of lethality was established. The ferocity of the crashes meant that many of the people I watched were killed. Their bodies were dragged to a pit outside the automobile factory and buried with slaked lime to melt away into memory. The fervour for perfection of the corporate engineers was matched only in equal parts by the willingness of the fascist guards to supply our bodies. Crash after crash, the injuries we sustained were logged. I have felt my nose break against bare steering wheels, my legs buckle in uncarpeted footwells, and my ribs crack under the stress of slamming contact whilst restrained. When we died, they would pull more from the death camps to replace us in our torture. The worst for myself were the head-on tests. 2 of us would be strapped into opposing cars, and the machines would hurl us at each other. I would have to watch the fear in the other person's eyes as we drew closer. I hated to see my face reflected in theirs, and almost welcomed the impact. I found I began to hope that it would be my last test, and perhaps I might find peace under the quicklime. That all changed during one particular test. The man across from me did not look afraid during our initial collisions. The engineers took delight in increasing our velocities and decreasing our protective strapping. They thought, perhaps, they were close to the perfection they had been seeking. It occurred to me then how strange it was that they were willing to use us for their tests, for all that they would beat their belittling notions of subhumanity into us and tattoo numbers on our skin. For that testing, they accepted we could approximate them in all the ways that mattered for a human body. The irony was near maddening. We would die for their test because we were accurate stand-ins for their supposedly perfect race. Before our final test together, the man across from me nodded, what I thought to be a farewell. They had released us from all but a few of the harnesses and increased the speed we would achieve before impact. I was ready for my death as the engines roared to life, and the acceleration pushed me back into the seat. I saw a glimpse of his hands, somehow freed from the straps, before he yanked the steering wheel down to one side and sent his car careening from the test zone. It bit into the crowd of eager onlookers and ploughed a bloody furrow through them until it obliterated a section of wall behind them. The crumpled metal was dripping with the red of those engineers, guards, and army officials. The torn mess of bodies it had left in its wake seemed to scream and groan as one mass before the medics rushed in to help. The man himself had survived his attack, barely. One of the lucky soldiers executed him by dragging his broken body from the wreckage and stamping on his already fractured skull. That one act gave me the hope I needed to survive the camp they transferred me to, and when the war was ended and we found ourselves to have been liberated, I thanked that unknown man every day. Yet the world is changing, and I cannot let what was done go unremembered. I cannot allow what they did to be deemed permissible or forgotten. I unclasp my seatbelt in my new car and allow the engine to purr under my foot. At the end of the street, the import dealership sparkles in the sun. Porsches, BMWs, Mercedes-Benz sedans, Volkswagen family cars, all shining behind the glass walls. I nod my own farewell and accelerate. It is my turn now.
Fuck me.
That was intense. I
Hey.
feel better. I feel better about taking a dark angle now.
Yes.
Oh, well, I'll do the bit that I always do, Ben. And I have a horrible feeling I actually already know this, but how much truth is there in that historical tale?
I have no idea, but I do know that all of the brands listed did use forced labour from Holocaust death camps.
And I guess even if people weren't used as crash test dummies, like people have been used for medical testing and other kind of, dehumanizing and destructive testing. So
yes,
there's truth even if it comes sideways.
Exactly. Yeah, it's got it. it's a bit of a marrying of those two things. But yeah, these are all documented collaboration companies with the Nazi Party during the Second World War. Yeah, and I just thought it was. I initially was going a bit more like sort of J.G. Ballard's Crash with it. It was sort of a bit more like autoerotic. If I don't actually, autophilia maybe rather than autoerotic, possibly. Anyway, but I kind of leaned away from that and more into the lasting impact and of fascism and the Holocaust and that kind of thing.
Intense.
I'm loath to call it cool as a concept, but if I can find a kind of more eloquent way to say that
it must have been, because we were obviously looking through the lens of Crash Test Dummies, the prompt. It must have been so fucked up for people that survived that.
Yeah.
You wander into a car showroom and just see the names and the sigils that have survived when a swastika sort of hasn't.
Yeah.
I know it's still used by Nazis and all that shit, but this is acceptable. Yeah, it's pretty hugely fucked up. And these are known brands. These are household names.
Yeah.
Hugo Boss is the same thing, though, isn't it? Where they
exactly the same thing.
Made those snappy uniforms.
Yeah.
It is strange. There's got to be some kind of like arcane science behind why or how these companies sort of emerge unscathed, and it is unscathed.
I think it's called money.
Yeah, I think it will have been
the arcane magic of capitalism.
I do not have that. What does it do?
If I was to like hazard a guess, though, it'd probably be that the way that Europe left Germany after the First World War is pretty, in a general way, often pointed to as one of the causes for the rise of Nazism and the Second World War, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's because it was so crippled in every possible way by everybody around it. So possibly removing manufacturing infrastructure, like the brands mentioned, was sort of seen at the time as a bad thing, like retreading an old false path. I haven't got anything to back that up. It's just that's the only reason that I could see not to
makes sense,
shut all this shit down. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so really darkened the door there a little bit. At least yours was fun.
Yeah, you just left us on a real bummer. So now
I could have gone first. Then it would have been an upwards arc to the baby trebuchet.
Right. As much as I'm like, oh, I'm glad I went first with the silly thing, I do not think you can go from a Holocaust survivor finally wreaking his what small vengeance he can to, and then he launched a baby like this. Yeah, the jump this way round survives. The other way round, no. But I mean, it's kind of an interesting point because it is a thing we're always at the risk of with this format. And I say risk, but I don't really mean risk. We never know what the other people are going to write. And you don't know what little genre journeys we're going to get on the podcast.
Absolutely not. It's often a mixed bag. There were some sort of big similarities between at least our stories, Finn. I think the concept of like the, it basically being an execution, I think that was sort of shared, and the some of the stuff about the way that we were describing what a crash test dummy does was pretty close.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought all of us had our dummies being living beings. None of us had like inanimate beings or robots or anything like that. We all, we all chose, let's test things on living humans. We just took a different angle on how they experienced that.
Very true. Yeah. Huh. Well, that was an interesting one. I do sort of feel like I've damaged the tone a little bit by going Holocaust with it, but there we go.
I mean,
It's out there now.
I'm gonna bring it back. Now we we wrote about crash test dummies. Do either of you? I mean, first of all, you both may be too young to remember. There was an animated television show in the early 90s called The Incredible Crash Dummies, and it was
Nope.
about sentient crash test dummies.
No, this doesn't ring a bell at all. It
Wow, I
sounds horrific.
implore everyone to go look it up. The Incredible Crash Dummies. It's got that like early fully CG TV show fuck ugly animation.
Oh no.
Like it's almost unbearably hideous. And it is also one of the weirdest. I remember having not only toys of these crash test dummies, but a VHS with some episodes of the show on. It's really weird, and I had to move as far. That's why I ended up on the thing I did, because I had to move away from this TV show that the prompt had dredged from my memory.
I see there's some baggage there for you.
Welcome to the tiny bookcase.
Home of baggage. I think we invented trauma, didn't we? That was a little while ago. A few episodes
I
back.
think we did. Yeah, we were the first people to discover it. It was quite a time.
Voyagers. That's what we are.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For magnificent beardery, let's cast the Chinicus folliculale spell on Gary Laird. For rich ginger tones on the scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne. And for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?